The world around us is changing. Population growth, resource depletion, economic inequalities, and environmental degradation are contributing to humanitarian crises becoming more frequent and affecting growing numbers of people. In a deeply interconnected world, crises easily spread to other countries. Global power relationships are changing. As humanitarians, our capacity to cope with 21st century crises is often surpassed. These crises involve many different actors and organizations with roles that keep changing. We need to evolve if we are to meet today's challenges. Responding efficiently to crises requires money, but funding is often tied to agendas beyond our control. We see situations deteriorating and have to wait until many people suffer and die before the media sees it, politicians pay attention, and resources begin to flow. It's difficult to plan for the future when funds are restricted to specific large-scale disasters. Additionally, donors often specify where and how they want their money spent. This means we can't always respond to human suffering when we see it. Instead, we find ourselves unable to respond with the speed that's needed and buried in bureaucratic procedures. We often become more concerned with compliance than with risk-taking. We know the synergy that results when the local and global levels work together effectively, but our current system doesn't allow us to make the most of the knowledge and capacities of local people and organizations. The current system is holding us back. Our way of working has become tangled and complicated. We can get paralyzed, feel overwhelmed and powerless. We need to stop for a moment, take a deep breath, and rethink what we are doing. We know that humanity has enough resources to respond to human suffering. We believe these should be mobilized more effectively. We believe it's time to change the way money flows. We've developed a global fund that releases money earlier and a capacity strengthening program in 13 countries. It allows us to work faster. It is independent, so we respond based on real needs. It optimizes resources. It makes more funds available to local partner organizations. It is rigorously peer-reviewed with transparent mechanisms. The START Fund enables NGOs to make collective decisions and respond quickly to under-the-radar emergencies around the world. Funded by UK Aid and the Dutch and Irish governments, it is a pool of money readily available and ensures we respond in a timely fashion. Thanks to this fund, we have an independent means to avert a crisis before it becomes life-threatening. We make hidden disasters visible, like the floods in Sri Lanka, and we responded 6 months before anyone else in the Horn of Africa. We are ready to take it to the next level. We are mature, successful agencies with proven track records of making bold, innovative, and exciting changes to the system. The conditions are ripe to further strengthen the way we as NGOs work together. We ratify the importance of a system where local and international NGOs work harmoniously and support each other. We must continue working side by side with disaster-affected communities, finding context-relevant solutions. We believe that collaboration is the new competition. Let's seize the moment. Let's up our game. Let's do it bigger. Let's help people improve the quality of their lives.
Okay, without further ado, let's just make sure everybody's paying attention. I am very excited because I got my Hugo Slim book signed. Thank you, Hugo. Good to see you again after all these years. And I got my selfie with Jan Egeland. So that was really interesting. And then I got to know who Saba is, almost a legend. Sean, you have an amazing task ahead of you. Where are you? Are you networking? Yeah, you are. So you have an amazing task ahead of you. I'm going to call, the next slide please, the following people to come up, Steve and Indy. And also, the next slide please, we're gonna ask the Hugo, Jan, Saba also to join this moment. Sean, over to you. Enjoy it.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is going to be a really interesting conversation. We're going to change the gears a little bit, have a little bit of a different format, but you'll get to hear from everybody. This session is about possibilities. So it's about activating our imaginations. So we've asked the panelists to help us think about what could be, what might be, and what could be. And now you've got their bios in your pack. I might say one or two things about each one when you come up. Panelists, you each have 10 minutes, and I invite you to come to the podium to address the audience. So we're going to begin with Steve Waddell, who he and I met first a number of years ago. He is a large-scale system change expert, and we're very lucky to have him. Steve, over to you.
Thanks very much. Is the clicker around for moving the slides? I'd like to do that. Okay, thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be here today with you. I've been very impressed with what I've heard. I'm impressed both for the high aspirations that you're holding for what you can do together, and impressed in terms of the content. In my language, what I work on is large system change. So when I say large system change, I mean a couple of things. Okay. I mean a couple of things. One is the very natural thing that you would go to. It means lots and lots of people and lots of organizations are involved or implicated somehow. It means often it's global. Often my work is global, just like a lot of yours. But more complicated, or more complexly, as I would call it, is the question of the type of change we're dealing with. There are three types of change, and it's important to understand the difference between them. So there's one type of change, it's called incremental change. It's, I want more money for our budgets, and we're going to keep on doing the same thing, but we're going to do more of it. Then there's, let's change the flow so that UNOCHA gets control of the budgets and then they distribute it to all of us. That's what reform is about, right? It's about changing the structures or the policy reform, something with regards to that. Transformation, on the other hand, is something quite different. It deals with fundamental rethinking about how we can be together. It has fundamental rethinking about the purpose of what we're about. So what I hear today is that you're really talking about fundamental rethinking, revisioning how we can be together. And one of the challenges with that is that it requires change of us and our organizations. It's not just about advocating to somebody else. So going back to the finance example, it has to do with how can we change the way we're gathering money? How can we change our resourcing base? It has to do with saying that we aren't just about Band-Aids, we aren't just about disaster relief, we're about building resilient communities. That's a different vision about what our outcomes are than what most people have traditionally thought about disaster relief. So one of the things to understand, besides these three types of change, is the system that you're working in. This is a map of the system that I did for you. So it's called a web crawl. The dots represent websites. The bigger the dot, the more links there are from one website to another website. So you can see UNAIDS down here is quite a large organization, quite a large dot, quite a large number of links to it. So this is one way to think of the system that you're trying to change, that you're trying to transform. Up at the top there's a little green dot, that's START Network. The red dots are actually some of the members of the START Network. The blue dot is UNOCHA. And you can see, well, you probably can't, but if you were close enough, you could see that it's overlapping DFID. And the proximity is important in these dots too, so it means that DFID and UNOCHA work quite closely together. So it's important to understand the system that you're trying to change. But there's many different ways of looking at the system that you're trying to change, and this is a different way, a different cut of the same map. It's understanding that there's two different worlds that are working here, which you've been talking about, that work with different logics. They have different ways of working. You can see that in this world, there's not much of an overlap. So there's some important organizations that are connecting between these two worlds. Then we asked the question about this map in transformation. Well, how would you like it to be different? How would you imagine this map to be different if you're really wanting to go about transforming the relationships? So one of the questions is, maybe you'd like to have business represented on this map in a different way. The only dot here that is currently representing business is the World Economic Forum. So it's part about envisioning how we can be together differently in the future. So one of the best ways to think of how to develop this transformational change is through a Skunkworks. Has anyone heard of this term Skunkworks before? So it's a change language where you put together a new organization. It could be just one organization that sponsors it, but it's even better that there's several of you that are sponsoring this entity called START. It's this place where you give legitimacy to this organization because of your names. You give it the status, and people pay attention to it because people know who's participating in it. But you create it as a space where you can try new things. And these new things are experiments. Experimenting is critical in transformation. And it's not so much about designing the future. Designing is a concept that is particularly used by architects and engineers. It's great for sending somebody to the moon. It's great for building a dam. It's great for the complicated type of issues where you have a physical science question, you have a clear goal in mind, and you have some physical science technology that's going to take you there. What you're all dealing with, of course, are complex issues. The possibilities are actually not clearly defined. You're always exploring them. It's a very dynamic system. There's many different variables that are unpredictable. So you've got a Skunkworks that's working in a complex system. One of the key interventions in developing transformational change is something that START has started. It's a lab. Social innovation labs have become popular over the last decade or so. They're doing a very important thing by creating a space for experimenting together. Now, all of you are expert at project implementation. You know, project implementation is something that you do based upon a historic experience. You can identify patterns. You can identify the logistics needs that are emerging because of your historic experience. You have a certain modus operandi to be able to do project implementation really well. That's not the same as experimenting. So it's real hard sometimes to switch to an experimenting mentality where you're trying to invent new things and trying to do things in a different way. So there's a development process here, right? You go from experiments, you develop the experiments, you have fruitful experiments, they turn into pilot projects, and then you can apply the project implementation mentality to them. So that's what a social innovation lab is about. Another key activity in this transformation space is learning. So it's about building a learning system. So there's one I worked on in Guatemala. It dealt with disaster relief when they were in small valleys. There's small valleys when there's flooding, increasing flooding. There's problems, of course, that result from that. Particularly with climate change, it's becoming an increasing problem. And in those river valleys, there's little village coalitions that are built as sort of communities of practice. And then we have, within one of the river basins, we have to have a community of practice so people can learn how to coordinate through that river basin. And then we have, across all of the river basins, we want to have a community of practice so that we can learn from each other across the river basins. But then we have the outside experts, such as yourselves, such as the engineers, such as the health experts, etc. they have a particular way that they've got to integrate their activity. And then we have policymakers who we spent a lot of attention on today, different levels from local to international. And then we have funders. We have to get the funders somehow aligned to be able to work effectively in this type of situation. And then we've got the learning system of all of those communities of practices as a whole. So this is one way to think of developing learning systems, and how do we experiment with the development of learning systems? Well, the third structure I'll just mention to you is this Global Action Networks. I worked for about a decade with Global Action Networks. So by that I mean something like Transparency International, Forest Stewardship Council, the UN Global Compact. And these are global change networks. They are about transformation of the world as we currently have it, and the logics and the rules of the system of the world that we have today. And they comprise several different subtypes of networks. They include, of course, interpersonal networks. Organizations are networks. They're just hierarchical ones, so they have organizational members. They have what I call interorganizational partnerships. So that's a small group of organizations who are addressing a specific task, and for instance, a specific disaster in a specific location, getting together for something that's quite time constrained, and you know when you've reached the end of it. And then you have the interorganizational networks. So this Transparency International, Forest Stewardship Council combine all of these different types of networks. And their change strategy is to change the system in which they're working. So Transparency International is trying to integrate values of disclosure within the bigger social system. When the work of doing this, there's one critical quality that you're looking for in terms of the people you're bringing together to be part of Transparency International, and that is they're people who are committed to that change. You don't want those who are just status quo. You don't want to have everyone in the world in the system to be a member of yours. That's going to just be another trade association. We know trade associations ain't very good networks. When you saw right up at the top there, that little green dot as being START network, some of you might have been worried because it was a little dot and it was very much on the periphery. Well, it's a little dot in part because not enough of you have your networks pointing to it because it's young. And it's up on the periphery, and that's the best place for a change agent to be. Once you're in the center of that whole map, you're a status quo organization, and status quo organizations are not very good change agents. So I hope that this has been somewhat helpful for you in introducing some of these ideas. We will tomorrow be having a workshop to explore these further. How do these all work together to create a powerful change system? So how do we put together the social labs, the learning systems, and the global networks for change? This is something that you're engaged on. It's part of your future, and I'm there to be supporting of you. One of the critical questions that I found from this conference is arising around the question of whether we're going to be a production organization or whether we're going to be a change organization. And when you're working on that path, from experimentation to piloting to project implementation, it's very easy to get caught into successes so that you become a production organization and end up doing project implementation instead of the actual experimenting. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'd like to welcome you for our workshop tomorrow. Take advantage of the offer of the book, and I want to just support you however I can to realize your highest aspirations and the great potential that you hold. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Steve. The next speaker is Indy Johar. Some of you may know Indy before. He works as a consultant for the network and helped us come to realize that what we were trying to achieve was a new economy that would enable the change that we've been talking about. So, Indy, over to you.
Thank you. I suppose I want to start with this phrase that's been used quite a lot: the next humanitarian economy. And in a way, I think what Steve has done is talked about the nature of change is changing. No doubt about it. But I think I want to go back to a point that Sean raised in the morning. The scale of capital. The bubblegum economy that we're all sitting here managing, right? So the size of the kind of humanitarian economy is quasi about 24 billion, and bubblegum sales are about 26 billion. Just to put us into the context, emotional context of what we're dealing with. We're all here equivalent to bubblegum managers, right? We want to change that. But we heard earlier this morning, in the earlier sessions, that actually it's unlikely that governments are going to be our allies in changing that scale of capital. We've also been hearing, actually there's a shift in the nature of that capital and how it's going to be given to us. Increasingly, there's going to be a shift from idea of investing into crisis management to prevention. Subtle thing, right? And we all think it's a good thing, we do. But actually, maybe there's some massive implications of this. Massive implications for all of you, all of us, which sit as bubblegum managers. Next. Actually, I hope many of you go to Steve's workshop, because he talks brilliantly and eloquently about how we are changing the nature of what we invest in. The nature of what we invest in is less and less about products or services or sectors, but increasingly about systems. I use often the story about actually, there's a fantastic NGO funded by a very large Indian corporate who started by giving smokeless ovens in villages. Very quickly realized that smokeless ovens were fantastic in reducing the level of kind of respiratory diseases, but rapidly increased malaria because the smoke was fumigating the houses. They then went back and said, no, we're not going to do product-based investment. We're going to do irrigation, sanitation, household appliances, education, health, a total village approach to investment. Now, what was interesting about that, they understood the interdependencies were the key thing, and sector and product-based approaches were not giving the level of outcomes that were required. And increasingly, when you listen to Steve and other people, you will start to see there's perhaps another idea of how we start to organize ourselves, which is going to become more and more critical. Next. Actually, how donors, and I use the word donors because there was a lot of words usage of donors earlier today, and actually most of you aren't in receipt of donor funds, you're actually in receipt of contracts, I believe, for outcomes or performance. Very little of your money is actually donor money. Here you go, do whatever you think is right. Actually, it's contract money. You are employed contractors. I believe 90-odd% of budgets are employed contractor budgets, right? Some large figure. So we use this word donor, which makes us feel good because it gets a perfect illusion of power when we don't have it. But it's like, fine. One, how do we shift from the pretense of altruism? And I think what we're seeing is donors increasingly, and I'm going to put this down as a challenge, the pretense of altruism from donors to enlightened self-interest. Donors shifting from the pretense of altruism, I am doing this because I believe that humanity needs to succeed, to enlightened self-interest. Increasingly, the conversation of trade, aid, and defense being a fused piece of thinking is because actually the issue is more and more about enlightened self-interest. Now, if we miss out the word enlightened, it's a pretty horrific future. But if that word enlightened comes onto the table, it becomes a very interesting future. And I think this is a real challenge for our sector because we prefer to live in the illusion of altruism and not recognize the truth of enlightened self-interest because it brings a different type of discourse. Second point I made already, we are contractors. We're not donor funded. So if these strategies are changing, why don't we bring them to the table honestly? What happens when we bring them to the table honestly? What is the nature of the conversation that we have when we bring them to the table honestly? So what I want to propose to you today is that good is changing. Good has been financialized. The future of good is quite different to the future of good and the past of good that we've all lived with. In this future, what is the legitimacy of NGOs? I think the question was hinted at earlier. In this future, we're mostly contractors and we're outcome buyers and we're actually commissioning. Why are NGOs important? Remember, bubblegum managers, right? Why NGOs? What is the nature of the NGO in this future of good? I think these are important fundamental questions. What is the role of the humanitarian principle in a contracted, outcome buying, risk, insurance-driven world? And I think what I find interesting is we don't want to bring some of these hidden conversations, which we all have in private, to the table with a degree of straightforwardness to allow for different conversations. If we want to bring the new financial markets to the table, impact investment of a scale and order to the table, these are questions that are going to come straightforwardly with it. And finally, what are the competencies of a new economy of good? When you cannot just legitimize, well, we help some people. When actually somebody's saying you bought the risk of flooding off the table of a country and you're trying to do mitigation strategies, what are the competencies required for this organization of the future? Why am I saying this? I think we're in a macro shift of how the economy of how we think about good is changing. Social impact bonds, catastrophe bonds, insurance, these are just indicators. They're like poems of the future. They're little whispers of the future. But what they're inviting is a different type of organization. They're going to invite a different type of ethics, a different model of legitimacy, a different model of what it means to be good. And I think the question you should ask yourself is, when you economize good, what is good in the first place? So what really differentiates you from the private sector, quote unquote? And I think there's more innovation going on about 21st century legitimacy in the private sector than there is perhaps even the NGOs I've certainly met. So what does that really mean? So when we talk about this word, the next humanitarian economy, let's really nail the fact. If we want to go from being bubblegum managers to actually something more significant, I think there's some fundamental questions on the table. If we want to take 26 billion to 260 billion, that's a scale of order of challenge that is fundamentally different and requires us to be a fundamentally different bunch of actors. And I think that is the question that, for me, START is about hosting and enabling. It is not just about organization of new capital, new ways of organizing, which Steve has been talking about, but also what is the nature of the organizations that are going to do this, and how do we do this better than Goldman Sachs or any other agency out there that we can think of. That, for me, is the challenge. And when you talk about the future of good, you're all sitting here. You are here to cast it. You are in the leading positions. The question is, as this new economy emerges, will you be there with it? And I think that should be the role of the START Network in facilitating that. With that, pretty bang on, I'll end.
Saba. Great, thanks, Indy. So Steve and Indy think a lot about systems, obviously, and we've asked them to come and help us think about systems change. Now we're going to have three speakers who will help us imagine what the next system might look like. So we're very privileged to have Saba Al-Mubasalat, the chief executive of the Humanitarian Leadership Academy. What would that system look like from your perspective?
I struggle with the word system. So every time I hear like system, I ask myself, what do we really mean? 2 days ago, I was with a man of science who was introduced to me by a dear friend. And this is a professor in one of the most profound universities. And he was really asking out of interest, what do you mean within the industry when you talk about a system? I paused for a few seconds because, you know, we had 1 hour together and I was meaning to use that time wisely. And I knew that if I started explaining what system means, it may take me a day. So the only thing I could think of was the Borg. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Star Trek. It's the collective. It's a being that in Star Trek symbolizes that thing that is so powerful and trying to perfect things at the very micro level to a point where it becomes self-destructive. That, to me, is what I struggle with. I struggle with a system where we say that a humanitarian Borg has all the answers to the questions. I think I'd rather use the word systems that come from the bottom up. That would lead to organic change that is driven by people and hosted by communities so that it will have life beyond a crisis. That's one. Second, I'd rather replace the system at the top level in our hierarchy into mechanisms and make sure that the microsystems that are created at the community and national levels have access to mechanisms that are adaptable, easily contextualized, and therefore can be used when needed, as needed. And I see the INGOs as the ones that move between the mechanisms and the very organic national and local systems. Facilitate access to knowledge, manage knowledge, and make sure that knowledge that's cultivated from the field level is taken all the way up to inspire an evolution in the mechanisms that are held by the humanitarian Borg. Let me put it this way, for lack of a better word. Our system needs to go through a natural evolution. We had a conference that was hosted actually jointly by yourselves, a START Network, the Academy, and the Kenya Red Cross in Nairobi a few months ago. And we had a great representation from civil society. They're advocating for being considered as part of the change and not what needs to change so that they fit the standards that were set at the very high level. Their voices are simple. They're not asking for too much. They ask for a system that is diverse enough to accommodate the needs of all, collaborative at the horizontal level, meaning the national systems are connected organically at the very national level, and have access to support when as needed from the international organization, UN agencies, and what have you. And they're asking for what START, I hope, will be able to offer, which is access to financial means that will allow them to sustain the investments in them. I come from 23 years work in the field. And in most of those years, I used to work for international organizations, and we always claimed that we are building the capacity of national organizations. In fact, we used to help them budget their salaries in projects, but by the end of projects, none of them could sustain the capacity of their organizations, and therefore, they could not survive. So in my world, ideal world, the system will be broken down into national systems, organic, diverse, collaborative, and protected from the changes that sometimes we impose on them but do not necessarily lead to good. So that's where I come from. And we would like to share with you some of the voices, the very genuine voices that came from the field and were documented in our conference in Kenya. So if we can play the movie, the documentary, I'd be really thankful. Not sure.
humans change? Can anyone change a system? We need to put our minds forward into the future, and then think about what type of future we're likely to experience, and what type of aid system we'll need in the future, and then come back to the present and think, what can we do now?
We talked about capacity building and how that word is misunderstood. It's almost like we need to expand people's understanding of different contexts.
When you work with the community, there is a sense of unity in the humanity. That it doesn't matter what we look like, it doesn't matter where we come from. When you have a problem, it is also my problem, and we are united in that.
When the Ebola virus struck Liberia, and all of the schools in the country was closed indefinitely to help curb the spread of the virus, I was homeschooling my 2 children. I decided to reach beyond the 2 of them to other children in my immediate community, and covering about 3,000 plus children. This meeting was a little more intimate than the last one I attended, and I feel that my voice, my experience was better shared here than the last ones.
This whole system has to be rebuilt from the ground up and not from the top down. So the future is hazardous. But if people are as well prepared as they possibly can be, that's all we can hope for.
This kind of conference has enabled the international actors to hear the aspiration and the needs of the local people, and also hear from the other side. We have also learned from them, and they also begin to learn from us. That is the beauty of all coming together.
I encourage all of us to go back again to the human within us and to remind ourselves that it's not about politics, it's not about systems, it's not about cluster mechanisms, it's about remaining true to those who trusted us on their voices.
Are captured in this report, which is available and was launched actually in this conference. And we will be carrying these voices to Istanbul because people trusted us on their voices. We're going to have a session tomorrow, 1 o'clock here, to bring those commitments that we're taking to Istanbul to you on how we are advocating for organic change that is led by people, starts from the bottom, and goes all the way up. It would be great to be able to hear your ideas of what commitments can help the system change in a positive way. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So next up is Hugo Slim, the head of policy for ICRC. I reached out to ICRC a couple of weeks ago, and when I saw one of their documents leading into the World Humanitarian Summit, and I wondered whether NGOs and the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement were coming to the same conclusion about what an ideal future of the system might look like. So I've asked you to come and tell us a little bit about that, but I know you want to speak to other things as well. Hugo.
Sean, thank you very much. And I think I should be giving you an after-dinner speech. It feels like sort of, you're all sitting at tables, and I should really give you an after-dinner speech because of this atmosphere. And I thought I only know one joke about change, and you probably know it anyway, but I'll tell it all the same. And it's a light bulb joke. So it's, how many psychotherapists do you need to change a light bulb? And the answer, of course, is only one, but the light bulb must really want to change. And I suppose that's a bit like the humanitarian system. That's what we're thinking about, and do we really want to change? But I would think it's not just about do we really want to change. And one of the things I want to say, and certainly what we feel at the ICRC, is that we are being changed. So that's really where I want to pick it up. And I want to thank you, first of all, for asking the ICRC to come and talk to you today. And it may be strange to you that the ICRC would talk of change because we are seen quite often as the one bit that just plods on and says the same thing and lives the same principles. But of course, if you look at our 150-something years, we have changed enormously, and we are constantly changing, taking on new mandates, whether it's wounded, prisoners, civilians, all sorts of new roles. So we do change. And I suppose where I want to start is with this idea that we perhaps have a slight illusion of the subjectivity of change, that we are the subjects of change. And what I want to pose to you is certainly what we feel in the ICRC, perhaps, is that we're really very often the objects of other changes. And that's what I want to think about in relationship to three particular things that we in the ICRC feel are changing us, and we know we need to be changed by these. And therefore, the idea that I might clarify a vision for change for you is unlikely, I'm afraid, because we don't really know how we're going to be changed by these three things. But we know we have to go with them. And the three things are this: communication, the relief development, division or not, and probably local action is the third. There are many other things that we think are changing us, but I'll choose these three because they've in a way come up today already. And the first one is communications, because of course that is the big thing that has been changing lately, means of communications. So what does that mean for us? We realize that there's going to be a lot more communication by people who need emergency help, who need humanitarian action, who are living in armed conflict. And there's going to be a lot more communication for us with people. And that participation revolution that Danny mentioned this morning is very much uppermost in our minds. How do we make that really work? And we don't have particular answers yet, but we know that over the next few years we will develop new practices in humanitarian action that are really about people communicating with us through all the new media, tweets and Facebook and all sorts of things, and us having to find ways to communicate with them about where water points are, about where missing family members are. That's revolutionized that area of practice for us. That, I watched someone on a sat phone in South Sudan the other day at a food distribution, having seen a picture of their mother, ring their mother. It was quite extraordinary. So that kind of thing we know is going to change us a lot, and we're very positive about that kind of change. But we also know we have to use it to hear people much better as well. The second area is this relief development argument that we've been having since I started in 1983 about, how do we balance the two? And I think we're realizing increasingly that it's pretty irrelevant. We don't have to worry about that too much. And we don't have to worry about that too much because the situations we're in, if we're in very long conflicts, as we are very often, we're working with people year after year to try and help them meet their needs and to try and help them secure the means of survival. And that means we're having to try all sorts of different things that involve supporting health services in whole districts, for example, for 5 years, because there are no more government workers there, whatever. So we realize that we're having to do a lot of what we don't call it development because we are not politically, ideologically developmental. We don't have a vision of a just society in any particular way. We're trying to meet people's needs. And that often involves for us what we call development holds, holding certain systems and structures of health, of food security, of detention systems which would otherwise crumble and deteriorate, and hold them to prevent things getting even worse and greater poverty. So we are, in fact, quite relaxed about that distinction. And of course, one of the reasons we're relaxed about it is because IHL says nothing about relief or development. It doesn't use those policy distinctions. It talks only about humanitarian action, and it makes no observation about whether humanitarian action lasts for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, or of really the kind of activities it involves. So that's another area where we are being fundamentally changed, I think, and happy to be changed, that we want to just talk about humanitarian action, and it will cover a multitude of activities, a multitude of time frames, increasingly, to meet many different needs. The third thing I want to talk about as well, because it's been such a key part of today's discussion, it's been such a key part of the Humanitarian Summit, is the question of local actors and local action and localization. Just to make an observation on that, I find it a very ideological discussion. Even today, I must confess, I've heard a lot of talk of empowerment and local actors and this and that and networks and things that will revolutionize the world. I haven't heard much substance about what it really means and how difficult it is and how compromising it can be for all parties. So we take a view on localization that, I mean, we're a profoundly localized organization in the movement of the Red Cross, Red Crescent, because we have national societies everywhere. We work with them very hard. And we know, actually, that for both sides, whether you're a national society or the ICRC or the Federation, it can be difficult. So some of the reasons that are difficult about local action, we've talked about global domination by, international domination of humanitarian action. You also get local domination. You get local dominators who capture processes. You get governments who are very resistant to this kind of activity, as we heard in the first session this morning. Civil society is feeling under pressure. That means there's often very compromised, difficult spaces for action as well. So I would encourage us to have a very realistic approach to local action and not a simple political, ideological, aspirational approach to it. The other reason we find working with local actors very difficult, and of course we do it all the time because we're bound by law and by our desire to work with local authorities of all kind, whether they're government authorities or armed group authorities. One of the challenges is the dispersal of local actors in many situations. If I look at our work in Syria, in South Sudan at the moment, we're often working in places where key parts of government authority, civil society authority have fled. They have been forced to flee. So actually helping local capacity to stay there, to come back, to be resilient is very difficult. We find it quite challenging. And also in terms of our own movement, people used the word asymmetry earlier. There are a lot of capability asymmetries between different national societies. You get the Lebanese Red Cross, which is a hugely competent organization that we just have to give money to, and it runs, the paramedic system for Lebanon. You get South Sudan Red Cross struggling in a new country to come to terms with what the challenges it faces. So I would prefer we have a really realistic discussion about localization, local actors, than a predominantly ideological one. And finally, I want to just talk about what Sean mentioned, is that we also, like Sava, we have problems with the word system. We certainly have problems with the word system in the singular, because we don't think it is one system. We think there are many different movements, a bit like Steve's map, but perhaps a bit more separate than that. Many different movements of humanitarian action in the world. There's our own Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, there's the MSF movement, there's loads and loads of church movements and Islamic movements across the world that are operating independently and working in various different ways. So what we're tending to talk about much more is an ecosystem, the idea not of a single mechanistic, complicated system, but as Steve said, much more of a complex ecosystem where there are different creatures operating in an environment and shaping that environment. And in that context, we would hope that the main criteria of any organism operating in that ecosystem is relevance. And it's very important that any organization, whether it be local, international, intermediate, is focused on relevance and meeting people's needs, identifying the right needs, and working to make sure that they are responding to need. And in that context, I think if I was to describe how change might happen in our sector, I would probably, although I don't know the literature on all this stuff, I would say that we are not looking at a system that we will design. So I would agree with Steve. We're not looking at a system we can design. We are looking at various systems and actors and ways of responding which are emerging. And I'm not sure we can take control of that emergence. We have to be part of it. We have to do our bit to be changed and change what we can. But I'm skeptical about being able to describe a whole system, manage a whole system, because it is an ecosystem based on need and money and political environments of different kinds at different moments. It's not a machine, and it's not one system. Thank you.
Great, and last but not least, Jan Eaglin is the Chief Executive of the Norwegian Refugee Council, which is one of the START Network members, but he used to be, in a former life, the Emergency Relief Coordinator for OCHA, or sitting in OCHA, and responsible for humanitarian reform. So I asked him to come and from your dual perspectives, reflect on what possibilities exist now.
Thank you. Good to see so many good colleagues here, and indeed NRC is a proud member of the START network. All great innovations in humanitarian action has come, to my knowledge, because of enormous failures, manifest failures of coming to the relief of people that were bleeding before the eyes of humankind. Humanitarian action really started when Henri Dunant, the founder of ICRC, stumbled upon the Battle of Solferino, and I think it was like 20,000 young men bled to death, and nobody helped them except Henri and the women of Solferino, and he wrote a book that made ICRC and the National Red Cross Societies. It was basically a call for action because people were bleeding to death and nobody did anything. Then, after Second World War, we all saw, or they saw, that the Europeans were refugees, and therefore the Europeans felt that something dramatic should happen, and therefore we got the Refugee Convention, and we got UNHCR that became the body for refugees. Europeans seem to have forgotten that now when we receive refugees to Europe, but the whole point at the time, end 40s and the beginning of the 50s when this happened, was that there was nobody around to help refugees when there were millions in need. So it was, again, the victims, the beneficiaries, the people bleeding who was the center of it all. Then came, of course, the Kurdish refugee crisis, 1991-92, which led to the so-called humanitarian UN-led system that exists today. I was then a very young state secretary for humanitarian and assistance, international assistance in the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I was very close to that process. Some of you will remember that the television cameras were all there when 2.5 million Kurds fled up in the mountains, and they were really freezing and suffering, and there was nobody there to help them. That led really to the Department of Humanitarian Affairs, which has become OCHA, the International Interagency Standing Commission, and the standby rosters, etc., 1992. Then came the genocides of the Balkans and of Rwanda, and it was very clear that all organizations had to scale up their capacity to respond and scale up their capacity to warn the world of horrific violations and genocides. Then came really 2004, and I was the emergency relief coordinator. Many believe it was the tsunami that led to the reform of 2005, but it's not true. It was Darfur. Darfur was the big thing at the time. I was very much the advocate of the poor people there being slaughtered by Janjaweed militias. And I was as surprised as very many others that when we finally got access to Darfur from the regime in Khartoum, nobody was able to deploy to Darfur in the desert. Well, I remember we needed 10,000 latrines. It was an estimate from one of the assessments. Nobody could build latrines, really. One organization after the other came to me as the emergency relief coordinator and said, "We have a new report on how bad it is in Darfur. Please have it." And I said, "I know it is bad in Darfur. Can you send 200 water and sanitation engineers? And can you do that?" "No, we cannot." So 2005 was really a time when we said we need predictable response capacity, we need predictable early startup funding, and we need some predictable leadership, field leadership. And that led to the famous cluster approach, bad name for what I called initially humanitarian partnerships around functional areas, water and sanitation, which was a gap area, logistics, shelter, big gap area at the time, etc. So the Central Emergency Response Fund, which couldn't be for NGOs at the time because it was a General Assembly resolution of the UN, but we managed to scale it up from $50 to $500 million. And then the humanitarian coordinators, which were supposed to become real humanitarians. At the time, they were development types who could not respond to humanitarian action. So it all happened in the course of 7 months, and many asked me afterwards, how could you do that? And the answer was really, we never asked for permission. We asked for forgiveness. I think that time may be over, actually. So I'm not so optimistic that in Istanbul, after 200 public events and 6,000 people coming to the place, they will agree on a new humanitarian reform. I believe that it will come again when there are tremendous manifest needs that nobody is really responding to, and then I hope and pray people will really do their thing and not ask for permission from everybody, including the UN member states. Let me end then by saying, perhaps if I can, what do I think lack now in humanitarian action? Well, I think in a way it's back again to say not who should do it. I mean, UN agency rivalry is pathetic, really. No, it should be my agency. No, don't give to that agency. That's not the thing. It's not really that NGOs should take over from UN, or not necessarily that always national NGOs are better than international ones. We're only talking about who should be on the stage to do this. We have to talk about who can deliver assistance and protection to the people in Aleppo, people in Kivu, etc. We should have sort of this, can it pass the Aleppo test? And at the moment, nobody's passing the Aleppo test. Nobody's delivering assistance and protection to the poor people of Aleppo. Those who are closest are the local organizations, certainly, and the doctors are being bombed. But we have to focus on the 3 Ps. I'm ending. I have 2 minutes left. To me, there are 3 Ps now. One is I think it's very important to return to the principles that you, ICRC, gave the world. Humanitarian action is being militarized, politicized, trampled upon. Counter-terrorism policies are making it more difficult for us to work in the most difficult areas. We have to really, teach each other that it has to be independent, neutral action with one aim: humanity for the people who are bleeding. Number 2, it's protection. The protection crisis is bigger than the assistance crisis. It is not true that we haven't had a lot of progress on assistance. Morbidity levels are down, mortality levels are down, malnutrition levels are down in nearly all emergencies now compared to 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. It's very well documented. I think it's protection where we're failing the most. Well, in a way, we're back to the so-called well-fed dead of Srebrenica. So we're able to provide assistance very many places, but we're not able to protect the most vulnerable of people. And thirdly, it's proximity. When people really need us the most, we're not there, really. Nobody's really there. Some are better. There are a few. I think, MSF famously and a bit arrogantly asked, who are everybody? But they had a point, really. How come we are 100 organizations in the capital city and 3 organizations on the front lines. And that is actually applies for the very many of the national as well as the international actors. We have to be there among those people who are really when you have proximity to people when they need us the most. So the 3 Ps would be what I will work for after now having been started 40 years ago. I have a few more years. Those are my priorities, and I really hope, in a way, we can focus on bringing hope through these kind of Kivu tests or Yemen tests. Let me end with Yemen. It's the biggest place on earth of needs compared to the lack of response in Yemen today. And whatever we do, it has to pass the Yemen test. We need to be there for those people as local organizations, national organizations, international organizations, when they need us the most. Thank you.
What a fantastic panel, and I won't attempt to summarize their points, but I have questions in my mind as a result of the varying perspectives. I thought it was a really interesting and appropriate canter through the different perspectives. The questions that I have in my mind, having heard you speak, are the first, how much control do we have? The second, how much agency do we have? Third, there isn't a singular high-profile event failure that's driving this moment as compared to previous moments of evolution of the humanitarian system. How much ownership do we have over change, or the need to change? Are external developments driving this moment? What is this moment? And thank you for finishing with hope, because I think that's a really important role of this sector too. Would you join me in thanking the panel?
Okay, so we know that a few of you need to take planes in a few minutes. So those of you, thank you. I told you it was worthwhile not leaving at coffee break. Thank you very much. So we're going to ask you to come down the panel. Thank you. Sean and I were going to co-facilitate a plenary session. And we're going to do this in the typical Juan and Sean fashion show. And we want to show a couple of questions to trigger the discussion in plenary. So we've heard this morning the future of civil society, different perspectives on how it could look like and how it's looking like. I love this phrase of India, of the whispers of the future, the poetry of the future. So we've heard quite a bit of whispers. After that, we went into exploring relationships with government and authorities. And now we are in the process of envisioning possibilities. So what we would like is to open the floor. So this is going to be a typical plenary Q&A session. But instead of cues to these invisible people, we're going to hear proposals. So let's hear proposals and reflections. And this is not about seeking consensus. It's not a debate. It's impregnating each other with views. Would that be okay? We still have a bit of energy? Okay, so we have 3 microphones circulating around the room. Sean is mic'd himself, and I am here. So Sean, you take that part. I take this part. Let's see where the rabbit jumps, and we'll see how to capture it as we go along. As Sean Larry would say, we are constructing the boat, sailing the boat, and what else?
We're designing the boat.
Designing the boat as we go. Good. Microphones, are they available? Yeah, please raise your hand if you have something to say. We have a hand over here, so can you position that mic all the way to that corner?
Someone from my side of the room, please.
Somebody in the middle and somebody over there. Okay, so we have one microphone there in the corner. Great. Go ahead. And before speaking, please identify yourself if you feel comfortable with it. If not, that's okay.
Thank you. In Steve's framework, I'm on the fringe. I am Marion McGowan, and I work at Middlesex University Business School, and my role is to link the academics with, I say this very gently if there are any academics in the room, with the real world. Okay. I find it extremely refreshing that we're talking in terms of a new economic or humanitarian economic vision, or whatever that statement was. For some time now, I have observed with great concern the polarization between the private sector, the humanitarian sector, and the international development world, and it increasingly makes no sense to me. For example, for me, the continuity of this polarization is leading to acceleration of the power gradient between the North and the South. The South produces, we consume. For me, I work very much with the development economists in not just in our institution, anywhere around the world, who are interested in looking at how the supply chains actually are the critical issue. If you look at after Rana Plaza, the capacity building work that needed to be done, the UK retailers wiped their hands clean, said we're not involved, but actually Laura Kunsberg then worked with ITV, went out there and found the labels. Similarly with food, work with coffee chains leading to, make it short, to my recommendation. World Economic Forum, no longer just the private sector in one room, the humanitarian sector in Istanbul. Doesn't work. Let's get together and create, let's start network, be the broker, the conduit to start building links with development economists, private sector, multinationals, the innovation labs around the world. It's not going to be a threat to anybody. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So if I'm hearing correction, this is about engaging differently and finding new ways of being together. And I'm linking this to the talk on Monday, remember, of Tara from MasterCard?
Yeah.
When she said that maybe we as humanitarians have a very unhealthy relationship with what money means. And she really challenged us to revisit our association of money and evil. And she gave us a very interesting talk. But she said, until we fix our perceptions of what money represents and our relationship to money, we are not going to truly engage in a healthy dialogue. So that's what Tara comes in, and you are making a very concrete proposal. Let's you start as a platform for finding new ways of being together. Gotcha.
You know what I liked about Tara's intervention was that she said, look, you guys think about money as greed, but what have you thought about it as trust? And I thought that was a very powerful observation that she made. Over on this side of the room, what about Silicon Valley? Brian.
Yes, I might be the only Northern California guest. I'm Brian with Box.org. I don't think there is another tech company here, but I guess that says it all. We need a little bit more interaction with the conscientious parts of the tech sector who are willing to be co-members and designers of new ways of operating and creating effectiveness in this work, be it the funding, the innovation, or the response pieces. I'm encouraged. I like what I see. I would love to get more of my counterparts in Silicon Valley in technology involved. And so anybody that can help me know who to reach out to in our extensive network, let me know. But I think the START network should evolve in some proximity there.
So Brian and I have been having a conversation now for a year about the overlaps and how the conversations about organizational networks and tech networks are quite similar. So there's a lot of potential synergies there. I wish I had a better word than that, but it's not really a question or a suggestion, but it's definitely an opportunity, I think.
So while we are talking here, our colleagues behind, Luke and Deep, you are processing these concrete suggestions, and we're going to put them up there for you to vote on their, some sort of priority. We'll give you the criteria in a minute. So we have two concrete suggestions, and that one is about also generating new ways of being together through bringing those type of actors like Brian through Box.org, Northern California, Silicon Valley, bring more of you type of guys into these type of conversations and other conversations. Help them to come together and find new ways of being together. I'm stealing words from the speakers this morning. Okay, let's hear from this part of the audience. Yes?
Wendy Fenton, excellent.
Thanks. Yes, Wendy Fenton from the Humanitarian Practice Network at ODI.
Can you speak a bit slower because your accent is difficult for me to understand.
Sorry. Wendy Fenton from the Humanitarian Practice Network at ODI. No, thank you very much for the excellent presentations. What struck me about them and what I think is interesting in terms of what START could focus on in the future is, I'm going to talk about money actually again, or cash. And I think that this issue of moving or scaling up cash, and I have to declare my interest as the former lead of the Secretariat for the high-level panel on cash transfers. But I think the transformational potential of cash as a catalyst for change is something that I think we shouldn't ignore. And I think we also need to remember that I was struck by Indy's talking about the sort of magnitude of the money involved. If we want to move to 270 million, is that really what we want to do? Shouldn't we be looking at how we can increase the size of our network, but that doesn't necessarily mean we need to increase always the growth of our money. Scaling up cash implies that you might have a smaller organization. You might have people with different skills. You would have people who are facilitating. There were some suggestions earlier, I think, in the feedback from the audience about how that might happen. So I would urge the network, I'm sure you're already thinking about these things, but to give this more of a priority. Thanks.
You want to say something?
I think you're right. You're absolutely right, Wendy.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is a very concrete proposal that initiatives like START Network could look at ways to further promote well-established, already proven, successful methodologies like cash, which is to me is a modality, for ensuring human dignity, right? And it's interesting how different people interpret different things when we all speak. The way I interpreted your talk had nothing to do with extending the resources. I really felt like a little bit, sometimes bruised, like, my God, this guy is calling me a pencil dragger. How do you call that?
Pusher, pencil pusher.
Pencil pusher. This guy is calling me a bean counter.
Yeah.
This guy is calling me a bubblegum manager. So I thought that was very elegant. I thought you were challenging us to move away from this projectitis into brokers of imagination and explore new frontiers, as opposed to being so concerned with compliance. That's what I heard you say. And maybe it's about reducing the amount of resources we mobilize. Maybe it's not about us controlling those resources. Maybe it's about exploring other ways of getting others to talk to each other without us controlling any of that. I don't know. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. Let's hear. Yeah.
I saw somebody, Nick Gutman, the former chair of the START Network for a couple of years, and still a trustee.
Thanks very much. It's great being here. So I'm Nick Gutman. I'm from Christian Aid and been involved in START for a little while. It's amazing being here to seeing the way things have grown hugely over the years. It's inspirational, it's wonderful, and I know the work that Sean and many others have done has made a huge difference, and I think really challenging the whole sector to innovate and take things forward. I agree with what other people have said, but I think one of the things that I'd like to see START Network, and that's all of us, it's not Sean and the Secretariat, it's all of us. We are the network. And I think one of the things that we should be doing, and maybe this is because I've been around a bit long, is going and focusing on some of the things which got ourselves together in the first place. And that is looking at ways of developing new funds to enable sort of trust-based responses at a local level. There's been quite a lot of talk about trust. The peer review process is about delivering humanitarian assistance based on need, based on principle. It's something that we started. It was the root of what we started doing when this whole thing set up. We have the Start Fund, which is growing. It needs to grow much more. It needs to be shifted so there's more Start Local opportunities for Start, or something along the same principles. It doesn't need to be exactly the same, but using the principles where local organizations are at the heart of working out where the need is greatest. But that needs resources, that needs us, all of us working together to make sure that happens. I'd really like to see us and the Secretariat working hard on developing national hubs, national Start funds.
So maybe I can, those of you who aren't involved in the network on a daily basis or even in the assembly will not know that we talk a lot about network structure. Every trustee meeting, there's a big agenda item where we try and get our heads around the network structure. And I think it was Steve, perhaps, or Indy, somebody talked about providing services versus change. And I think that what we're coming to in the network is we don't have a business model for investing in the growth of the network. We have a business model built around providing services for the members. But in terms of how we take this vision, which everybody agrees and wants to make happen, into a reality is a work in progress. So I think that it's really important that it was that it was aired, and I think also we should know that we're designing and building and sailing the ship all at the same time, and there are some things that we haven't yet figured out, but it doesn't mean we don't want to do it. We haven't been able to crack the business model.
Okay, so I'm hearing also another message here of distinguishing the Secretariat from the network. I'm hearing this: be careful not to fall in this trap that has plagued the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, the UN, the MSFs, of the network is not the Secretariat. I'm hearing, remember, it's a network. It's not a team of 24 highly committed, mostly young, I've noticed, individuals working sharing a table at Save the Children under incredible circumstances, actually. So you are a Secretariat. There is a network.
Matthew Carter, again a trustee, and just to add really, Sean, I think it's having worked with Start the last couple of years, it's the network bit that we've most struggled with. And the conversations this afternoon from Steve and Indy and Ross and Juan, we have to bring them in more closely. We have to find a way, because my sense is we keep, and it would be interesting to hear their comments on this, we keep falling back to quite conservative models. The safe zone is when we start looking at creating a network is what we know, and then we get stuck. And actually Start is about, at the center is around innovation, and if we don't crack the network bit, we failed. Because, and break away from what the traditions of structure and norms that are familiar with us, and those safe areas. And this is where we need to bring people to work with us to help shape something that's very different.
Hi, I promise I haven't snatched the microphone. It was given to me. My name is Haroy. I work for Samaritan's Purse. I head up our disaster response work.
Which one?
Samaritan's Purse. As I say, I head up our disaster response work. I wanted to say how impressed I was by today. I was only able to come today because we're not a member of the Samaritan's Purse. The network, the Start network. I apologize. But I was really impressed by the amount of thinking we were able to do today, the level of discussion that we had, and our vision for the future. It's quite a future-orientated network. And so we're doing a very good job of analyzing the trends that we see and thinking about, okay, how do we make the most of opportunities? How do we tackle challenges and so forth? So brilliant, brilliant network. And I also completely agree with what's been said about the need to think about like the global south and setting up other networks and so on and so forth. So all of that I totally agree with. One thing that I might perhaps suggest would be in our thinking about including others, I would also suggest that we don't also forget a few other organizations that may be based here in the UK that could still benefit the network and that the network could still benefit. So I don't think that would necessarily take us back to the traditional, more conservative view. I think what we have discussed today, I think the START network is a really, it has the potential to quite dramatically change the way that we do humanitarian response and development work. And I would love for us to expand this influence, not just globally, but also think about, okay, not also just focus there, but also think about, okay, what other organizations can we influence? How many of them can we still embrace in the coming year? And how might we still benefit from those that are still based here? Thank you.
Juan, we could talk about growth models and stuff. I'm really conscious of what you warned about the Red Cross Red Crescent movement as well. There are lots of people in the room who have been trustees since the beginning and could probably answer some of these questions. And I don't know how you think we should play this.
Well, I think there's just a few minutes left, and I would like to explore a few questions here. And if the trustees or anybody else feels the need to address some of the questions, please feel free. This is not a Q&A session for Sean and his START team secretariat. This is a conversation where we're hearing propositions. So if that's okay, let's go. Let me just make sure I understood you. Are you suggesting that when we think of national organizations, we just don't think of the Bangladeshi, Mexican, Kenyan national organization, but that we think of the UK-based national organizations? Is that what you're saying? As one way of rethinking that? Okay, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to make sure I understood. There was somebody from here, I think. No? Okay, there was somebody, the spotlights. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, who was first? Back there. Okay, so then, Sean, you take that one, and then I take yours.
Hi. Hi, my name is Fernanda, and I'm here as a quality of a humanitarian. We're talking about shaping networks, and we're talking about shaping switching powers and bottom-up change. And I have to say I've been really motivated and encouraged of all the ideas and all the out-of-the-box thinking that we're doing today. But I would also like to propose about what about reshaping ethics? What about reshaping humanitarians and making these humanitarians making actually change? So having the opinion leaders of the humanitarian system with us today, what about reshaping the ethics for which we work? So for me, that would be like a bigger picture, but going to the basics. Thank you.
Okay, so a little bit what Hugo was alerting us to, right? Let's go back to the principles. Jan was saying, let's recover what these fundamental humanitarian principles are all about, especially the 4 that are commonly agreed. And Hugo was telling us, be careful to politicize the discussion. It's not about local versus global, it's about proximity. So we hear you, okay?
There are a couple of people with microphones down at this end of the room. At the back, please.
Yeah. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. So I am from Caritas Bangladesh, one of the national organization. So our expectation from our side, because we are very new member in this network, so we as a disaster responder, we see that as START network is for new start. So whether the START network can introduce their community level reporting system. So normally the people, those response normally send their report to the donors, not to the community. So a start is a new start for change. So whether this change is possible or to think for that in future.
Sorry, I didn't get that. Is prepositioning, did you say, which system did you talk about?
System, actually I wanted to mean that normally for making any response, we send the report to the donors, not to the community.
Got it.
So if it is possible in futures that to report with the community for our works.
Okay, so you're suggesting that START, together with its members, puts emphasis on this item which has been widely recognized as a problem and invent innovative ways of doing that, right? That's what I'm hearing. Is that what you're hearing, Sean?
Yeah, it reminds me of a similar point that was made a year ago by John Borton. I look over to see you there, John. And there's maybe you want to also comment on that one. Is there a microphone for the back table?
Yeah, thanks. Yes, I would fully support that. I mean, that's another way of transforming, is to actually follow through on the rhetoric of involving affected communities in what we do and reporting back to them. I mean, it's one of the it's not been seen through. What was proposed, 10, 20 years ago has not been seen through, and it's still there in the room, and it needs following through. And it's another area of achieving transformation. I think comparable to or larger than cash, the modality, is actually the involvement of the affected communities. Thank you.
So, thanks, John, and thank you as well. I mean, as a broker, I see the possibility of making rules that we can adhere to ourselves. I mean, what the network hasn't done yet. I'm looking at the trustees and the members in the room. I welcome your comments on this. But what the network hasn't done is made resolutions of itself to we will ensure that affected populations influence the provision of aid. There are possibilities available to you as a network to change the rhetoric into reality, just by agreeing it amongst yourselves and standing up for it.
Okay, we have one microphone here.
Yeah, hello, I'm Inoni Chadburn from Tier Fund. I just want to build a little bit on what we heard this morning on where some of the significant voting was coming from our online coordination, and that is about actually why don't the local NGOs contract the INGOs? I mean, that builds a little bit more, but if something that START can do is to actually begin to design a system that could buck that, and actually begin to say, listen, what is it we would be funded maybe by international donors on the basis of how much we have contracted ourselves out to local NGOs. Somehow we need to talk about this shifting the power and actually create some new systems and move on that journey that we're actually breaking the system beyond piloting, beyond experimenting, but actually moving into something that's really completely out of the box.
Exactly. I mean, the possibilities are there. You have agency by collaborating in this way. You have the possibility to write rules for yourselves that can transform the way things are done.
Okay, so that's another concrete proposal that we just heard. Okay, so explore the modalities where this shifting of the power, reversal of the power, could be done in the way the transformation proposed by Steve can happen. Not the reform, but the transformation. Okay, how are we doing back there with capturing all of this? Are we doing fine? Are we ready to show something? Soon?
We have a point from Cadena.
Yep. Just go ahead and talk. The technicians will make sure.
Okay, yes, it works. Hi, I'm Daniela Blanc from Cadena. We are one of the new members of START Network. We're from Mexico, also one of the, I think the only one from Latin America. And coming back to the questions, I want to say that our expectation from this network is firstly to understand it and to see how can we use the Start Fund, the Start Labs, the Start Engage, to understand it really, and to see how, as members, we can give back to the network, because that's what it's for. If we strengthen the network, it's going to strengthen our organizations as well. So we need to understand how it works to see also how we can strengthening. And of course, I agree with what the lady over there was saying about the project. So yeah, because from now in Mexico, this network, basically nobody knows it. So we need to strengthening us as a member organization. We need to understand what it does and promote it in our region for it to be more strong there and everywhere.
Okay, so that's another concrete task.
It's a concrete task to help new members understand and engage with it. And definitely have a work plan in the Secretariat to do that. But I think I would also say that we're the organization has shifted, the network has shifted considerably in the last week, because we've increased the membership by 40%. So 18% of the members are national organizations like yourselves. So I think that you could also argue that the culture of the organization is being reinvented as we speak.
Okay, so tomorrow on the Members' Day, let's make sure that the new members are, actually a few of the sessions of tomorrow are designed for new members to get all of this introduction and to get some of the basic information, and then contribute actively to shaping and reshaping this network. That's what I understood the way we designed the day tomorrow. If the network is not well known in Mexico, maybe you should talk to the special representative in Latin America, because he's not doing a good job.
This guy?
I don't know what he's been up to. Hanging out too much in London, maybe. We have another comment or question here, and then we're going to start wrapping this up.
Okay.
We have a hand here, and then we have another hand.
Oh, there's one or two over on this side too.
Okay, so let's go that side.
Yeah, thank you. Talking about evidence, change, and partnerships, I was just wondering how you understand or see the role and position of the scientific community in relation to the network.
Okay, would you like to suggest something? I'm going to protect him from that. What do you suggest?
Well, maybe research programs associated to the questions that are being raised into this room, and would be quite interesting to support the process of change, for example.
Okay. Can you tell us who you represent here? Who are you?
Yeah, I don't represent anything, but I work in the START network, in the Engage Learning project.
Thank you. We had now one person.
There was that person right behind you had her hand up earlier. Do you still want to make a point?
Yeah. And then we go here, and then we start wrapping it up, Sean.
I'm Jerry Curry from NSET. We're with the .ngo domain. And one of the things that we've heard over and over was making sure that the funding flows to those that are closest to the crisis-affected community. And so I think it's one of those things where we need to start thinking of how we can potentially, as a sector, start to legitimize and identify local actors that might not have been previously identified prior to the crisis. So many of the members work with organizations already, and so that would be perhaps their go-to local actor to recommend, but perhaps there's others that should have an option to be able to look into the START Fund as well.
Thank you.
Where is it? I cannot see it. Yeah, it's here.
My name is Susanna. I'm here with Consensus, which is a blockchain development company. We're building applications using blockchain technology on Ethereum, which is a peer-to-peer decentralized network. And we have been working on a pilot project with Start Fund, building a decentralized digital governance platform called Boardroom, which is essentially aimed at allowing members of the Start Fund to make decisions quicker regarding how to spend the funds based on the kinds of resources that are on the ground. in these crisis areas. And I just wanted to suggest, I was curious to know what your stance is on blockchain technology, and I think it's really interesting to be here and learn about all of these issues that you guys are trying to solve, to try to shape, because this technology is so new and it's in such early stages of development. I think it's really important to know what your needs are to shape this to suit your needs. So I'm really interested to hear more about what you guys are looking for, and it sounds to me that there's a lot of possibilities for collaboration here. And so
thank you.
Okay, it's very clear. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to have a session at tomorrow's Members' Day that's going to test, looking for Anne-Marie and Paul, that's right. We're going to test the Start Fund on a blockchain. And so you find, if you're curious about this, if you've heard the term, then come to the session tomorrow and find out. But definitely, there's a lot of really exciting possibilities with the use of blockchain and distributed ownership. It's very consistent with the values and principles that people are saying they want from this network of networks. So I think this could be quite an enabling technology.
I agree. It's very exciting.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to talking more tomorrow.
Okay, great. So I think the talk on Monday of blockchain as a game changer, just the fact that it was chosen as one of the 8 topics was already an indication that it is a game changer, and we learned there that we don't need to understand it, how it works, but we can use it. So that's where we need people that know how to use it, and we'll do that tomorrow. Okay, Sean, shall we start wrapping this up and then start showing something here? Are we ready? So you wanted to ask?
I mean, I would put one more thought into the room, perhaps, so I read a book recently called Swarm Wise.
Again, please.
Swarm Wise. So this book was written by the founder of the Swedish Pirate Party. You know, about 10 years ago, there was a political party in Sweden. It was around the time when Napster came out, and 80% of the Swedish population were sharing music, and they're breaking the law. And it became obvious to this fellow that if 80% of the population is breaking the law, then the law probably should be changed. And so he wrote a little manifesto, on a half-finished manifesto, and put it on his website on New Year's Eve, and sent out a message to some people. And overnight, he got 30,000 members. And so the book is about how to deal with exponential growth. And I think that's also what we're talking about here, is creating a structure that would truly release control, so that groups who we don't know can spontaneously organize in a way that would allow us to affiliate with them. So I think that it's very interesting, the position that you're in right now. There are these countervailing forces, the anti-terror legislation and the control regimes, and the desire to manage risks versus the need to create a structure that would allow for spontaneous exponential growth by people who we haven't met yet, who can work with us to create the change that we're trying to create. So it's a fascinating moment, and I think there's lots of possibilities. So thanks for the suggestions. I'm looking forward to seeing them on the screen.
Okay, so let's see what can come up within the screen. I'm starting to get used to specific members of your team saying, just 2 minutes, just 2 minutes, just 2 minutes. And with this one, I'm going to give this process back to Sean. You invited me in the morning to do a process of facilitation for the day. The day has finished. This is our last activity. We really hope you've enjoyed it. I myself enjoyed it. So Sean, we just project this. We ask the people to vote. You invite them to the cocktail. We acknowledge the presence of Dr. Randolph Kent, the honorary chair of the START Network. If you are planning to leave after this session, you're going to make a big mistake. If you are planning to leave. Why? Because there's going to be canapes, there's going to be free wine, there's going to be free juices for those of you who don't drink wine, and we're going to hear 2 speeches of, I am told, 6 minutes each. One will be by the Minister of State what's his name?
Desmond Swain.
So Desmond, a Minister of State, which is very influential to many of you, and also by Dr. Randolph Kent, who is the honorary chairperson of the START Network. So those two speeches are looking really good. So we invite you to stay, and Sean will make the formal invitation. So let's vote on which of these you think the START Network should concentrate its energy, resources, intelligence, intuition, emotion for the coming foreseeable time. Vote on which one you think they should concentrate. That doesn't mean that this vote will define the future. Let me be very clear. There is a governance structure still in place that will meet on Friday to analyze all of these results of today. But we would like your opinion. We are seeking opinion.
I think there are 5 things. Is that what you're saying, Diti?
Okay, so how many are they total? 10. So choose the top 5 that you would like them to focus on, and with this number of people we will get a very good spread. Thank you, Sean.
Okay, while you're voting, this ends the formal part of this part of the conference. But I would like to say a few well and richly deserved thank yous. First of all, would you join me in thanking our very talented curator for the day, Juan Sanz? Thank you. You know, there's a very strong tradition of civil society and political acumen from Latin America, and I hope to see more of that joining the network in the near future. So thank you, Juan, for bringing that spirit into the meeting today. Where's Jem Gherkin? Is he around? Jem is working. Good. He shouldn't be here. He should be working somewhere. There are people standing around the room who work with Jem. There's been a lot of work over the past months. It's been almost a 10-month project to put on this day, and Jem has single-handedly managed things. But the people standing up around the edges of the room too, the team, have worked really, really hard. We were here at 7 o'clock this morning and have been working all weekend. So there's been a lot of work to help create this environment, and I would invite you to join me in thanking them for all their hard work. I think also, I don't know whether Paul Smith Lomas is still here, but there are 10 trustees of the START Network who put in their time voluntarily, and particularly the independent trustees. We have 4 independent trustees of the START Network, and they contribute their holiday time. So they take their holidays to participate in the governance of the START Network, and that's an extraordinary contribution that I'm grateful for, and I know you are too. So I don't know whether they're here in the room, but I think we should thank the trustees for navigating this crazy network and just all the tensions and paradoxes that are inherent in what we're trying to do. Thank you to the trustees. Okay, I think those are the main groups of people who I wanted to thank. We're all involved in this, and so we could be thanking ourselves. I think this is the right thing to do. If I was an investor, I would invest in you right now. Yeah, let's go downstairs and have a much-deserved drink. Thank you very much, everybody.